point.
I do it just for you.
You do it just for me, I think. You know, I've been listening very carefully to folks and listening to how the farmers really caught hell. I'm from Wisconsin. We have soybeans. That's in the mix of stuff that really took a beating. But the strategy was just to subsidize them. I want to know, number one, for people, how sustainable that is, and is that worth it if we had the across the board if we did the across the board tariffs, you know, we could just keep on subsidizing the losers. And, you know, the $6 trillion, Mr. Ferry, are you suggesting, you have been suggesting that this could pay for the tax cuts? You mean all of them, the whole TCJ, FJ, they could pay for all of them without raising prices. And so I find that you know, the $6 trillion, we didn't find that the tariffs really trickled down to people that much. And I guess I am wondering, your model, you know, how you got to the $6 trillion
Well,
in a couple of seconds.
the first thing I want to say is that when I was a kid in the 1970s, my dad was a union print worker in New York City earning $200 a week. Okay?
That was good money.
That was very good money, and on a part scholarship, I went to Harvard. And the reason why a lot of the kids from my neighborhood went to Ivy League schools was because their dads were working in jobs that had high productivity, and they were able to get good money in those days. Today, we're in a completely different economic mess. Now I'll answer your question. $6 trillion comes from $600 billion a year. Our model suggests that if you've got $3 trillion of imports and you tariff them at 20%, that's $600 billion a year. The difference between my model and one difference, there are many differences, one difference between our model and other models is that other models assume imports will decline. Brendan Duke and I actually agree that imports are only going to decline for a short period of time. The trade deficit will remain. So imports move up again. You're tariffing them at 20%. The net result is those $6 trillion. Now, what you do with those $6 trillion is critical. And I wrote a paper.
That's right, because if it's just CEO pay, then that's going to be a problem. And that's what we've been experiencing, Mr. Gresser, to pick up from where he left off. The $6 trillion and how it circulates in the economy.
For sure. A couple of things. One, if we're taxing $3 trillion in imports and getting $600 billion out of it and the imports don't decline, one, that's not realistic. Two, it would mean there's no effect on the employment mix that Mr. Ferry is talking about. So that's not a realistic assumption.
It doesn't create jobs.
Not in the outcomes that he's discussing. There have been very serious criticisms of this model done by, for example, Robert Koopman, the former USITC director who oversees the USITC modeling. So I would be very careful about accepting these figures at face value. What we're talking about in a tariff of 20% on imports is a 20% tax on crude oil, $250 billion worth of crude oil. We're talking about a tariff of 20% on clothes. We're talking about 20% on appliances. Most of these things will bring in some money and raise prices. I did look at one appliance, toasters. In order to make toasters in the United States and pop-ups, based on the experience of Japan and Italy and UK, they have to cost about $300 each. You're talking about big impacts on middle-income and low-income families with very little return in the economy, and probably
And then how much do the subsidies cost to save soybeans and farmers? Is that worth it?
The subsidy for ag, I believe, is about $28 billion for lost exports. So you're essentially paying people who were making good livings and honest livings and doing very well because they're now kind of on their backs. U.S. government, we spend $7 trillion a year. We can afford to spend $28 billion a year, but why? You know, why not let people keep winning rather than subsidizing them for losing?
Well, so little time, so many questions. Yield back.
Thank you. Let me recognize the gentleman from Kansas again, Mr. Estes. Well, thank you, Mr. Chairman. I hesitate to jump into the give and take you and Mr. Schweikert have. I don't know whether I should call you acting chairman or Lord Chairman. Lord Chairman, okay, sir. This is a
Current chair.
current chair. Excellent. Well, great. This is a great opportunity to be able to get together and talk and have another round of questions. There's so many good things we want to talk about. I think so much of what we're all trying to look at is how do we get a good, strong, growing economy which ultimately provides good jobs for Americans and ultimately helps with raising tax revenue to help support the government functions that we want to have, and trying to figure out what the right policy decisions are for all of those implementations. There's a couple of questions I wanted to ask just as a follow-up, and Mrs. York, one of the things, going back into the testimony that you had, the question I had, I was trying to follow through the thought process on the double taxation of savings as it relates to a decision that somebody makes to consume today versus invest. And because to me, if they make that decision, consume today after you're paid the payroll versus investing it, the tax would be on the earnings of the investment. Yes, it's delayed, but it wouldn't be on the original investment itself. So I was trying to follow that double taxation process.
Yeah, we've got a handy chart on our website if you want to see like some number examples. But essentially, when you pay tax when you earn your money, that reduces how much you have able to put into savings. And then when you pay tax again on the return to that, it further reduces it compared to a tax where you either, like a 401k, you get to deduct that saving up front and then pay tax on the total withdrawal at the end, or like a Roth IRA, you've already paid tax on your income, you save it, and then you don't pay tax again when you make your withdrawal. In that system, you're neutral between when you're consuming your money because you're not facing that additional layer of tax for delaying your consumption. But if we do put that additional layer of tax on the returns, when you've already paid tax on your principal, that's further reducing what you would be able to consume in the future. So it discourages that saving activity. It's similar to what we see under the corporate tax, where you don't get to fully deduct the cost of your investment immediately. So the tax falls on that investment and increases the cost of capital, very similar to double taxing saving at the individual level.
All right, thank you. Mr. Ferry, at the end of my previous round of question, you'd made a comment that really stood out in terms of that China's manufacturing base is double the United States, and that goes to highlight a lot of what I was trying to highlight as we're talking about how do we incentivize free and fair trade and making sure that we have open markets that people can engage in a capitalist society and moving forward. One of the things I wanted to talk, I had a question in general about for you is that, one aspect of tariffs is to help protect the United States against some of these abusive practices by other countries. We've had major concern about the Chinese Communist Party stealing intellectual property for decades. And now, as Mr. Schweiker pointed out, in terms of we've started this round robin of multiple subsidizing. China's doing a super deduction for research and development expensing, which makes the United States even more vulnerable. How do you think tariffs or other trade tactics can be used to protect the United States intellectual property in future years?
It's very difficult to protect intellectual property from such a resourceful Secret Service and a huge operation that the Chinese run. I myself worked for technology companies that were victims of Chinese intellectual property theft. I don't think tariffs are the central weapon to protect against that. There are export controls and there's better security, but what you have to understand, and I think we sometimes don't take a strategic enough view. We have to step back and we have to say to ourselves, in a world like this, where we run $1 trillion trade deficit, China runs $1 trillion trade surplus, and you've got other countries also exploiting our propensity to consume rather than produce, how do we rebuild our economy? And the way we do that is we rebuild sectors that are strategic, and semiconductors are one sector. There are many, many sectors that are strategic, and yes, there'll be duplication. China will be doing its own, as they are, and it's mostly, to an incredible extent, it's based on technology that was developed here, often in Silicon Valley, and stolen. But we have to accept that duplication if we want to maintain our country as a free country.
Well, thank you. Thank you for all the witnesses for being here today. I yield back.
Thank you, Mr. Justice. I'll go my second round of questions. I first want to make the point that on the deficit reduction that the tariffs generate, that's only deficit reduction if we don't use it to pay for tax cuts, which is, I think, is the intention right now. So we would anticipate the deficit, much to our consternation, continue to go up greatly in the next 4 years. Mr. Duke, Mr. Ferry said they want to manage the dollar to a competitive level, which is easy to state. I think Milton Friedman probably rolling over in his grave, which is okay with me. But I would love to get your take as a competing economist at Kaplan, the idea of managing the dollar to a competitive level.
Sure thing. So our trade partners, they can manipulate their currency. They did that in the teens. But I think fundamentally, the reason why the dollar would appreciate from this is because we are taxing imports, right? And that just causes the dollar, like there's no distortion to fix here. Like that's just what we would expect to happen. And I think fundamentally, I think the reason why we have a trade deficit, a big part of the reason why we have a trade deficit is because we have a fiscal deficit, because we don't save enough. If we want to address the dollar, the simplest way to do that is to reduce the deficit. I think a really good way to reduce the deficit is to take the $5 trillion of tax increases on the wealthy and corporations that President Biden put that toward deficit reduction, not just put the Trump tax cuts on the credit card, causing the dollar to appreciate, but bring down the deficit. It's about 7% of GDP right now. That strikes me as a way easier way than getting into managing the dollar, which I don't, Mr. Bessent made a lot of money off, speculating for a hedge fund. I don't think, we should exactly be doing that though with the US Treasury. So I think there's a simple way to deal with an overvalued dollar, if we think that's the case, that hurts our exporters, which is to reduce the deficit. There's ways to do that without harming Americans.
Thank you very much. Mr. Gresser, in your stated remarks and even in more length than you've written, you talk about the constitutional challenges. That Article 1, Section 8 of the U.S. Constitution gives Congress the ability to set tariffs, trade policy. Over the years, Congress has passed at least 6 bills that I know of. 201, 302, the IEEP that my friend Ms. Dolbeni has a very good bill on right now, that basically give this power back to the president. Why is that a bad thing, and why is that especially a bad thing in light of our inability to pass a continuing resolution this afternoon? When Congress does things so very slowly, why not defend the president's right to manage trade policy all on his own?
Well, I think the most direct answer is respect for the Constitution and its text and what powers it gives to the Congress and what powers it gives to the president. But in terms of the laws you're mentioning, there are definitely some that I think are responsible and useful delegations. If you create a trade promotion authority bill that says, negotiate trade agreements, here's what we want it to look like. If you succeed and you satisfy us, you have proclamation authority to lower tariffs. Or on the other side, anti-dumping law. We think Congress, this is what dumping is, this is what we would like you to see do with petitions, here's how we'd like you to investigate it, here's what we'd like you to do. What concerns me is an open-ended right for the president to create any new tariff he wants, to cut any tariff he wants, to do whatever product, whatever country. I think that is a recipe for very bad government, for very bad choices. And going back to my first point, Congress should exercise its responsibility. The Constitution says Congress has the right to, or the responsibility to deal with foreign, and regulate commerce with foreign countries, and it has the sole right to lay and collect taxes, duties, imposts, and excises. And I think that there's good reason for that, and if laws like IEPA or Section 301 have gotten away from that, then I think Congress should think about dialing them back.
Thank you very much. Mr. Gressler, one more relevant question, because I read your trade remarks every week. We're losing Earl Blumenauer, who's been the champion for getting rid of the $800 de minimis exception for all these goods coming in from China. I forget what it's a big, big number. I don't know, $1 billion a day or something like that. What's your perspective on de minimis, especially in light of the conversation about tariffs? Because it is closely related.
In terms of de minimis, I believe there are about, when Congress passed this law, there were about 100 million packages coming to the US. Now there's about 1 billion. That does raise interesting questions, and it does put American retailers in a difficult position where they're paying the full tariff and individuals buying online are not. So I think there is some, Congress has some good reason to rethink some of this. I would like to think that there's some ways to do it without raising prices on individuals and families. So that's where my starting points are.
Okay, great. Mr. Ferry, did you have any input on de minimis?
Yes.
I saw your eyes twinkle over there.
Yes. I think de minimis is effectively a free trade agreement with China. It's enabled them to ship billions of dollars of goods into the U.S., putting thousands of manufacturers out of business. Now, as it accelerates, it's putting retailers out of business. And I'm hearing from business people that if we lose our retail channel to the consumer, then we lose the ability to sell. So it's hurting both manufacturers and retailers, and I think we ought to put a stop to it immediately by abolishing it entirely. And remember, we're the only country in the world with an $800 limit on de minimis. And I'll say it again very briefly. We have to decide whether we are a country that consumes or produces. Too much of what I've heard today is about how wonderful consumption is. If you look in history, the decline of empires like the Spanish, the Dutch, and the British come about because the ruling class gets obsessed with consumption and does not produce enough, and then a crash comes. We need to produce more of all the goods that we're now buying through de minimis.
Thank you. My research assistant from Arizona has just pointed out that de minimis went up 209% in the last 6 years. I recognize my friend from Illinois, the distinguished Congressman, Mr. Snyder.
Thank you, and I'll go to Mr. Gressler. And this may or may not, I'm looking at your testimony, this may or may not be a fair question, but as I study history a little bit, in the 1980s, we imposed an embargo shipping grain to the Soviet Union. And I've looked at reports that show in Illinois, we never really recovered from that. The high point was 1979, and we lost those markets because other people went to other places. I'm wondering if you look at the last 4 years of the last administration and the embargoes, have industries recovered from the impact of the trade war, or are American industries still struggling?
It's a great question. There's, I think, strong evidence that agriculture has not recovered from that we have lost market share for the long run. One thing that's interesting to me on the manufacturing side is that over these past 4 years, the use of steel in the United States has declined pretty sharply. So we're importing a lot less steel than we did before, but we're not making any more steel than we did before. And capacity utilization is below where it was before the tariffs. What that suggests to me is that construction and auto businesses, big buyers of steel, are figuring out how to make do with less. So they may be recovering over time from the losses they got from that. But that overall means a contraction in the U.S. manufacturing sector, which is being overcome over time, but not because we're making more steel over time. It's because people learn from scarcity and they can adjust sometimes. So your question is right on, that these things have long-lasting effects, and they're sometimes rebound on the people or industries they were meant to support.
Yeah. I mean, expanding on your comment about necessity. Necessity is the mother of invention. It's not just that they make do, it's they find alternatives or innovation comes and it accelerates that replacement of one product for another. Mr. Fair, I want to pick up on what you said, the loss of retailers. When we talk about supply chains, value chains, it's a chain, and it's saying it, I guess I'm into the aphorisms right now, but a chain is only strong as its weakest link. And for a manufacturer to get its products ultimately to a consumer, there's a lot of links in that chain, but the last one is the interface where the consumer actually can see, touch, and acquire the product. What do you see as the long-term impact of a decline in retail because of inability to, address the de minimis issue?
The impact of the decline in retail is, among other things, well, it's serious at several levels. First of all, it's a decline in tax revenue for state and local governments, which depend dramatically on retail revenue. And Congressman Beyer and I live in the same district, and a lot of the revenue for the city of Alexandria comes from the retail community. And the more they buy from Shein and the other the other de minimis China sellers that are selling tax-free, the more that tax revenue declines. That's number one. Number two, retail provides a lot of jobs. Even though they're not high-paid jobs, they're jobs for a certain type of person. The person who loves fashion works in a fashion retailer. The person who loves bicycles works in a bike shop. And those jobs are in decline, which adds to the problem of mediocre jobs and more people working in temporary jobs, working, in warehouse or delivery type jobs, or which are unfortunately two of the main growth sectors for people without college degrees or without high school degrees. So it's a serious issue.
Thank you. And then let me close, Mrs. York. I'll turn to you. You had an article in Tax Foundation last month talking about the inflationary impact of tariffs. Can you describe some of the other effects tariffs will have on the economy, both short and long term?
Yeah, the big long-term effect is that they reduce the real value of after-tax incomes by increasing prices that we pay in the United States. And they also lead to a less efficient allocation of resources by transferring income, transferring jobs, transferring production to the targeted firms and away from where it's currently employed. And we have evidence from 2018 and 2019 that that's what happened. If you look at the U.S. International Trade Commission report, if you look at studies by academics, they find net decreases in manufacturing employment, net decreases in manufacturing production because of these downstream effects. Yes, tariffs can create benefits in the protected industry, but you have to weigh those against the downstream costs as well as against retaliation, and the net impact for the U.S. economy is very clearly negative.
Great. Thank you. With that, I yield back.
Thank you. We are honored to be joined this afternoon by the distinguished lady from the state of Washington, former chair of the New Democratic Coalition, and many other honors. Ms. Domeni, the chair is yours. The floor is yours.
Thank you, Congressman Beyer. Thanks all of you for joining us and for sharing all of your thoughts. I'm joining today's committee hearing because my constituents in Washington have a lot of questions and concerns about the incoming president's new sweeping tariff proposals. I serve on the Ways and Means Committee and the Trade Subcommittee because trade is very, very important to my state's economy. More than 40% of jobs in Washington are tied to trade, ranging from technology products to aircraft and trucks, as well as billions of dollars of agricultural products like seafood and dairy. Our port workers serve as a gateway to the rest of the world, bringing in energy products and semiconductors that fuel our economy, and exporting American wheat, corn, soybeans, and much more. People in my district generally benefit from lower tariffs, which are just another word for taxes on Americans Americans pay on imported goods because the cost of these taxes are mostly passed along to consumers in the forms of higher prices. To be clear, sometimes using tariff as a targeted tool can be helpful. Tariffs can be part of a holistic strategy to push back against unfair trade practices of another country and to reduce dependency within our supply chains, or to protect American industries that are important for our national security or fighting climate change. I've introduced legislation that would impose a tariff on certain goods that are produced in carbon-intensive ways. But sweeping tariffs, like the ones that President Trump has proposed, can damage communities across the country and raise prices of everyday goods like groceries, gas, and prescription drugs. Economists, including several of our witnesses today, have estimated that if these proposals aren't tempered, the average American family will pay thousands of dollars more per year because of increased prices. And the last thing Americans need right now is higher prices. These estimates don't account for retaliation, which can be devastating for American industries. In my state of Washington, in 2019, apple growers across our state lost millions of dollars in market share in India when they retaliated for tariffs that Trump imposed on steel and aluminum. It took 5 years for India to drop those tariffs, and during that time, many multi-generational family farmers left the industry. And so these kinds of sweeping tariffs could fundamentally reshape our economy and risk sending us into recession or sending our communities into economic hardship. So Congress needs to have a say in major economic decisions like this that affect our district. As Congressman Dyer talked about, I've introduced legislation called the Prevent Tariff Abuse Act to prevent any president, Democrat or Republican, from imposing sweeping tariffs under the guise of a national emergency without a vote in Congress. I know we talked about this a little bit earlier, but Mr. Gresser or Ms. York, do you think the president should be able to raise taxes on Americans by billions of dollars without consulting Congress?
I think it's very clear that broad sweeping tariffs would have a negative effect on Americans. We've also estimated tax increases on U.S. households exceeding $2,000 with universal tariffs. Congress very clearly has the authority here, whether that is repealing a tariff that's already been imposed or whether that is adding some checks to the tariff powers that have been delegated to the president.
Mr. Gresser.
I think almost any time, anywhere in the world, where a president or prime minister declares states of emergency and tries to rule by decree, it's not a positive sign. In the case of the U.S. Tax and tariff system, the Constitution is very clear. This is a congressional power. And so, no, I don't think it's appropriate for a president to declare a state of emergency and then use it to do whatever he likes, especially if there is no emergency. And I applaud you for the bill you've introduced on IEPA in particular.
Thank you. Mr. Duke, how could sweeping tariff increases on Canada and Mexico and other top trading partners impact export-focused industries and jobs like those in Washington State?
Yeah, I can think of I can think of 3 ways. First of all, as we discussed, tariffs cause the dollar to appreciate. So all of a sudden, they're less competitive abroad. That Indians, the Washington apple costs more to them in the Indian rupee, and that's what happens. I think a second part is that U.S. exporters are our biggest importers. They rely on imported goods to stay competitive. There was a study that showed Trump's first round of tariffs were the equivalent of a 2% tariff on U.S. goods abroad because of those higher costs that they bore. The third part is obviously retaliation, just as you said. And again, for no appreciable gain, it's just to do a sales tax on coffee and bananas. That doesn't make any sense to me.
And lots of times the retaliation is on industries that have nothing to do with what the original tariffs are, so it makes it even more complicated. No, thank you. I've gone over my time. Thanks, I appreciate it, and I yield back, Mr. Byer.
Still, Benny, thank you very much. We're almost done, but I have a couple quick questions. First of all, Mr. Snyder said that necessity is the mother of invention. I want to point out that Thorstein Veblen said that invention is the mother of necessity, too. Second, I am concerned about how in the last round with Trump, our office, among many others, was deluged with businesses applying for tariff exemptions and wanting us to write letters and intervene with the administration and the like. I mentioned earlier that at least somebody had done research that showed that firms favorable to the administration get better treatment than firms unfavorable to the administration. Mr. Gresser, could you talk at all about how corporations could game this system, or is there an opening for corruption because of who gets to pay the tariffs and who doesn't?
Yes, tariff systems are going back 200 years. Former Treasury Secretary, Mr. Gallatin for Jefferson Madison, pointed out tariffs are very opaque and non-transparent in comparison to other sorts of taxes, and relatively easily manipulated by wealthy and connected businesses. The problem I saw with the exclusion system you mentioned was that they were asking about 30 or 35 trained and talented people to handle 53,000 applications for relief. The GAO found that each of these petitions got on average 10 to 15 minutes review from a frontline staffer and then 7 minutes from a supervisor. So it was a generator of random outcomes. It wasn't a real process. And I could easily imagine that businesses which are larger or older or for whatever reason more tied into the political system would have been better at getting these petitions in front of a political person who could say, oh, okay, actually this one looks kind of meritorious, let's give it another thought. So yes, a system of this sort is going to attract so many applications, it will overwhelm the people working on it, and the outcomes from that level will be unpredictable, and those which are better connected for whatever reason are probably more likely to get a better read on their petition. So I think you're spot on.
Great, thank you very much. One last question from Mrs. York. Thank you for educating us all to, I don't know all the initials, but the cash flow tax system. There are many things that I'd love to see, when falling asleep at night, getting rid of the Electoral College or meaningful immigration reform or, getting our budget deficit down from 37 trillion. When you talk about what sounds like a wholesale change of the way we tax in America, a completely different vision, how do you see overcoming, 125 years or 140 years of history? What are the steps between where we are and the Erica York vision for tax policy?
The first two steps are fairly straightforward, and we've already taken steps toward them. Full expensing for capital investment, that's had bipartisan support in the past, like expensing research and development costs, doing bonus depreciation, improving the tax treatment of structures. So that's fairly familiar policy. And then in the TCJA, there was also introduced a limitation on interest deductions. So it's going further in that direction and fully moving the tax treatment of interest. So both of those are within the political realm of things that have already been enacted. The big change is, of course, the border adjustment. And I do think that's more novel to the policy community who hasn't been in the weeds of what tax economists have been writing since like the 70s. So this isn't a new idea when it comes to academics who study tax policy and who study what's the most efficient way to structure taxes. But again, even if you just do those first two steps, full expensing and offset some of the cost of that by reforming the tax treatment of interest, you eliminate many of the impediments in the tax code right now that discourage investment and discourage production. So you go a long way, and you don't even have to do the border adjustment side of it to get that benefit.
By the way, I rarely defend the TCJA, and I'm not going to now, but full expensing is the one thing that I've seen has a significant impact on investments. With that, thank you all very much for joining us. This probably won't be the last you hear of tariffs in the coming weeks and months. But we just want to say again that economists on the left and right fear that President-elect Trump's tariffs risk shrinking our economy and harming Americans. We've emphasized again and again, the Constitution says it's our responsibility, not the president's. And I want to thank all of you for participating so nobly in this. And thank you to my colleagues, and thank you for letting our fellow Ways and Means members wave onto this discussion. Questions for the record may be submitted after the hearing. The record will remain open for 3 business days. And the hearing is now adjourned.
And thank you for letting me give you notes.
Yeah, thank you. I'll get this back in 4 years, right?
I actually maybe in 2.